So I am really happy to be here today, and I thank you, Bijou and Patrick, for organizing this. Because I've been scheduled as the first commentator, I thought I would first take a stab at sort of introducing where normative deliberative theory is today, and then I'll turn to comments on Arjun's thoughtful paper. Okay. So you can see why I needed a slide here. So Arjun notes on his page 2 that there's been a consensus amongst many theorists of Western democracy that, quotes, deliberation is preferable to aggregation as a model for shaping group preferences. And yes, that's true. For shaping group preferences, for actually coming to decide what it is you want, deliberation is the best thing in town. But that doesn't mean that deliberation's the entire democratic process. And I think that one of the things that's happened over the past decade or so in deliberative theory is that deliberative theorists have become more and more at home with talking about the interface between the deliberative system, what I've called the deliberative system, and the aggregative system. For example, you might talk, and in your talk you might clarify the fact that you have very conflicting interests. You might come in thinking you had common interests. For example, your employers have been telling you that what's good for General Motors is good for, what's good for the company is good for the workers, and you bought that line. But after talking about it, you realize, no, we're in conflict. So deliberation can clarify conflict. It isn't always something that should be aiming at consensus. When it does clarify conflict, what do? You can't come to consensus, so you might very well take a vote. And the aggregative system here on the right has standards of its own, like equal power. Each person's vote is supposed to count equally. That's what legitimates the aggregative system. So there are things that legitimate the deliberative system, these standards, and I'm going to get to those standards in a minute, because they've changed a lot over the past, or they've been refined a lot over the past 10 years. But the point is that these two systems work together a lot. And I think the next step for deliberative theory, for those of us who do the theory as a business, is to try to talk a bit about, to try to analyze a bit how those things come together. Just quickly, when it's a matter of context. When there is a common good to be forged, then it's really worth spending a lot of time trying to forge it. And in what I call the deliberative system, there are many, many spaces. There's formal deliberation to a binding decision, like the kind that you see in legislatures, but there's also the kind of everyday talk that I've written about and that Ann Swidler writes about in Malawi, in which, and I'm arguing, and most deliberative theorists agree now, that kind of talk is part of a larger deliberative system. It may not come up to all the standards to which I'm going to get in a moment, but it's a very vital part of making sense of our lives, coming to understand whether we can forge a common good, whether our interests are in conflict, what we should do, how we should do it, who we are. Those are important things that come about in ways that are quite different from the kind of interaction that's going on right here, or the kind of interaction that goes on in a legislative assembly, let's say. So everyday talk, group performances of the kind that Arjun's talking about, interest groups, et cetera, all those groups deliberate, and the same groups more often aggregate, at least some of them do. The justificatory process all along is deliberation. That is to say, if you're going to say, okay, what makes a legitimate aggregative system? You have to sit around sort of thinking about that, and you deliberate about that, and you say, a legitimate one is one that has equal power. You come up with those standards in a deliberative way, and then later you look back and you say, now, was that election legitimate? That's, again, a deliberative process. So it sort of comes first and it comes last. That's in the justificatory process. And an important point that I'd like to make that was not there, let's say, in the early Habermas, is that legitimacy actually has plural sources. It has deliberative sources out of good deliberation, but it also has aggregative sources out of good aggregation, many different sources, and in none of them can actual practice reach the ideal? So even in the aggregative system, there is no polity. Even the little town meeting that I studied, or the left-wing participatory group that I studied back in the 60s, didn't get equal power. You can't reach equal power, which is the aggregative standard, any more than you can reach absence of power, which is one of the deliberative standards. These standards are not reachable. They're what we call regulative ideals, that is to say, ideals that are there to strive for, but that you can't reach. Jesus Christ said, "Be perfect as thy heavenly Father is perfect." That's not obviously a standard that anybody expects to reach, but were his words meaningless? No, it was a regulative ideal, sort of move in that direction as far as you can. So there's plural sources, and it's there, and it's a spectrum, not a dichotomy. No polity ever reaches the fully legitimate part of the spectrum. So I'm going to move on to talk about these standards that I talked about. The classic standards that you might read in, let's say, Habermas or Josh Cohen or some of the earlier theorists of the say 70s and 80s or Dennis Thompson makes accountability, let's say, quite important. That's because he's talking about legislatures. But when we move to things that to, let's say, me and you talking, where does accountability come in? In some sense, it's there, because we are all accountable to one another. I ought to be accountable to the poorest peasant in Bangladesh in a wide way, and I'm accountable to you guys here in a closer way. But we don't have any formal systems of accountability and so forth. Publicity. That was a big one. Kant said that the maxim of our actions should be subject to publicity. But note that he said the maxim should be subject to publicity. That is to say, any kind of rule ought to be processed publicly. But he didn't say that every single legislative act ought to be, a piece of deliberation ought to be public. And deliberative theorists are, in the last 5 or 6 years, sort of realizing, no, there's got to be a lot that goes on behind closed doors, because there's a lot that I need to say frankly to you that I can't say in a public manner. So publicity turns out to be something that we are now looking at much more closely.